Aloha, everyone. Kako. Thank you so much for joining us on Wednesday, September 13th. We have a fireside chat with the Martin Zorn. Martin, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you and your time and everything you've been doing for the Hawaii startup ecosystem. I'm going to start off with the why. Why did I ask you to grace us with your presence and your words of wisdom? About 6, 7 years ago, Martin's been around and supporting the innovation ecosystem for over a decade plus. He was one of our first mentors through Boo Startups, and I just connected with him so well. And when I heard a story about the company that he is supporting, originally called Kamakura, I was like, wow, this is fascinating. Martin was also on the board for HTDC, Hawaii Technology Development Corporation. And anyways, I'm going to jump right in. So Martin, Kamakura, and for those that you don't know, and you're going to introduce this yourself, but it's such a fascinating company to hear being headquartered out of Hawaii. And, started in 1990 by two PhDs, one out of Harvard, one out of MIT. These individuals basically wrote the books for a lot of what students today are learning, which is fascinating. They're backed by Nobel Prize winning economists. And it's just so interesting to see and hear how some academics really created this company. They're still involved today. And of course, got acquired for a boatload of cash, an undisclosed amount, by a $3 billion company called SAS. So with that, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us about it?
Sure, I'd be glad to. And aloha to everyone. Glad to be here, at least virtually, and look forward to meeting all of you in person. So Vincent asked me to give a quick background on myself as well as on Kamakura. So I worked briefly coming out of undergraduate for EDS, which at the time was owned by Ross Perot. I could spend a whole nother session talking about Ross Perot stories, but I'll skip those. And then I joined Wachovia Bank, which is now part of Wells Fargo. So I was with Wachovia Bank for 21 years. The majority of that time I was in corporate banking and capital markets in a variety of different locations. Started in Atlanta, spent most of my career in Dallas, Texas, and then finished in Washington, D.C. before we were acquired. Probably the most significant part of that career history for this group is when I ran capital markets and corporate banking in Raleigh, North Carolina, Research Triangle Park. During that period of time I was there, I created a technology investing and lending group for Wachovia, roughly modeled at the time off of what Silicon Valley Bank was doing on the West Coast, and there was nobody else doing it in the East Coast, especially in a tech hub like RTP. And during that period of time, I also was on the board of an early stage life science startup venture fund called Eno River Capital. And that was an interesting experience because that fund was developed in part with money from the state of North Carolina to invest in very early stage life science companies. And when I was asked to go on the board, it had PhDs, it had MDs. Most of the people presenting were people, because Glaxo was headquartered there. You had the 3 medical centers between Duke, UNC, as well as NC State. I wondered what my role was, because some of the things that they had developed, I couldn't even pronounce the Latin, never mind understand. And I soon learned. I asked really dumb, simple questions like, who's going to buy this and who's going to sell this and why are they going to pay for it? And I quickly learned that was what my role in the venture fund was. So Wachovia, fast forward, was purchased by First Union Bank. At the time that they were purchased, I took my package from them after 21 years and worked for a turnaround bank in the Midwest where I was the chief financial officer. During that period of time, a couple interesting things occurred. One, Later on, to be quite honest, I was getting a little bit bored, and one of our board members happened to be the president of University of Southern Indiana, and he said to me, "Hey, Martin, we're looking for some adjunct faculty members. Why don't you, think about doing that?" So for about half my time there, I was on the adjunct faculty at USI, teaching primarily investments, at night. Which was an interesting experience, for me. And the other interesting thing during that tenure there is that it happened during the Great Recession. And another area I could write a lot of case studies is everything a regional bank should not do, because this institution played every trick in the book to try to grow at 10% in a market that was shrinking to flat. Including leverage programs, investing in high risk, high yield instruments, one of which was a CDO, a collateralized debt obligation called a trust preferred CDO, which stopped trading during the credit crisis. And that's what connected me with Kamakura, because at that point in time, the systems we had in-house couldn't model these instruments. I didn't want to use what's known as matrix pricing, which is simply the same brokers on Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and the others that sold this stuff to the bank. I usually don't say stuff, but you know what I'm referring to. Sold this stuff to the bank, would use matrix pricing, which is a fancy way of saying, hey, let me take 3 names I think are like what you already own, but are still trading, average them, triangulate them, and give you a price for them. And they certainly had no incentive to give us a good price. Their incentive is to make it look like we weren't losing a lot of money. My incentive was to stay on the good side of the Securities and Exchange Commission and provide an accurate mark. So I'd known Don for a long time, and I called Don and I said, can you guys model this? And the answer was yes. And he kept me in very good position with the comptroller of the currency, the Federal Reserve, and the SEC during those years until the bank got sold. Once we did sell the bank, I actually called Don, and this was my second banking crisis, having been with Wachovia during the Texas bank crisis, running an office in Dallas where I was a beneficiary of that crisis. And I said, Don, I don't want to go through another banking crisis in my career. So can I use you as a reference? And he knew that I owned property in Maui. And long story short, he said, I'd be happy to be a reference. Why don't you come work for me? So, as a result, I moved to Honolulu. Actually, I moved to Maui, and he allowed me a commute into Honolulu during the week, and became basically first the CFO and then the president and chief operating officer of Kamakura. So part of my goal at Kamakura was basically to take this incredible intellectual property that he and Bob and others created and maximize its commercialization, kind of clean up the company, scale and commercialize what can be done with us, and ultimately put us in a position to have an exit strategy. And through all of this, the story, when we moved, Don started the company in Kamakura, Japan. Technically, it was in Kamakura Prefecture. It was actually in Chikasaki, Japan, but Kamakura is a lot easier to say than calling the company Chikasaki. And when he moved the company here, he looked at U.S. headquarter locations. He looked at the West Coast, looked at Hawaii, and at the time, Act 221 was coming into place. There was the opportunity at the Manoa Innovation Center, and the combination of the two is how we selected Japan, as well as the fact that the majority of our employees that moved, there were 8 of them, were Japanese nationals whose wife, when they were given the choice of living on the West Coast or Hawaii, all said Hawaii. And being a startup, they know what that means in terms of the hours that their spouses would be keeping. And that's how we ended up here. So we won years ago the Governor's Award as the largest exporter, because we have no customers in Hawaii. We just have our research and development teams. We're here in Hawaii. We sold our products globally. In fact, at the time that we sold the company, our clients were in 41 different countries, about 60% in, probably 40% in Europe, 1/3 in Asia, and the remaining third in North America. So that's a little bit of a background. Since I've been here, again, personally, Vincent mentioned I was on the HTDC board. I'm also continue to be on the board of the Maui Food Innovation Center at UH Maui, and also was on the board of Arcadia. If you're familiar with Arcadia and 15 Craigside, it's the largest senior health company in Hawaii, and I'm the non-executive chairman of that board. As well as Vincent already said, I was one of the inaugural mentors when Blue Startups began. So have always been supportive of the tech and the startup community here in Hawaii. So Vincent, let me turn it over to you and the team in terms of any questions. I'd be happy to talk about what Kamakura does, if that would be helpful. But with that, let me turn it over to you for where we go next.
I'd love for you to talk about the IP around Kamakura, the open nature of it.
Yeah, so Kamakura Corporation, basically we have two products. The core product we had was Kamakura Risk Manager. And what that is, it's a software system that basically looks at financial risk. So, a couple things, I'll mention is that the way Don started this, when Don left Lehman Brothers in Tokyo and started Kamakura, he did a lot of consulting with the Japanese banks. In the 90s, if you recall, just about every bespoke derivative in the world had a Japanese bank as a counterparty. Most of them did that, but they didn't know how to value it. And because it was so bespoke, there was no traded market for it. So he started developing financial calculators. So the first aha moment was basically the fact, regardless of the type of instrument, 90% of the code was repeatable. So whether you're talking about an interest rate derivative, a futures, forward contract, an option, you could basically distill down the financial mathematics to contractual cash flows, which somebody will either pay or not pay, behavioral cash flows, they pay early, they pay late, and then optional cash flows. So the key is basically doing a better job of forecasting those future cash flows and then knowing how to discount it, because the discount rate that you use, and depending on how you smooth the appropriate curve, gives you the market valuation. And because it doesn't matter whether it's a mortgage, a car loan, a bond, or a sophisticated derivative, the math is all the same. And that's what allowed him to build this integrated system. The other thing that happened is while he was there is when the Nikkei crashed and the Japanese real estate market crashed. And the conventional wisdom is stock markets always go up and home prices always go up. Of course, we learned that the hard way in the US in 2007. That's not always the case, even though it happened in Japan 20 years earlier. And that's what started his relationship with Bob Jarrow, who was an expert in terms of how to correlate asset prices in the market, real market prices, to underlying cash flows and what those correlations are, and the fact that you can't always use statistical methods to do it, because what usually happens is that that basically statistics will only show you what has already happened. So that's where the whole thing during the credit crisis, where people wrote articles like the copula that destroyed the world, because everybody looked at two standard deviations and basically their models were built on a premise. If it never happened in the past, your models aren't ever going to predict it'll happen in the future. So one of the differences that we did, although we're financially oriented software company, interestingly enough, all of our developers were actually physicists, including one who basically was at the Lawrence Livermore Labs, and when we hired him was teaching at UC Berkeley. Another one we hired was actually at University of Hawaii on a NOAA grant to study neutrino penetration of the polar ice caps. I had to look up what a neutrino was when he told me that. But the advantage we saw of hiring physics PhDs is they were very comfortable in a simulation world of trying to build models for things that you may not have already seen. And that basically allowed us to develop a financial modeling software that outperformed our peers. We also created a second product called Kamakura Risk Information Services, which basically took these models and applied them to specific default probabilities of public firms, non-public firms, sovereign risk, and sold them in a software as a service as a product license. So those are a little bit of detail around the two products that we developed.
But then you told me when we first met that part of the strategy is to keep this and challenge the entire ecosystem to say, hey, here's our thought process, here's our algorithms. Tell us what we're not thinking about, what we're doing wrong.
Yeah, so in terms of that, basically kind of our proprietary information isn't the models. I mean, the models are, peer reviewed and academic research. It's out there. Everything we're doing is in the public domain. Our distinct advantage was figuring out how to tie this together, into, a model that could be used for any financial instrument, and second, to find additional uses for it. So let me give you a real rough example. So, if somebody shows up at the emergency room holding their chest and bending over saying they can't breathe and they feel a lot of heavy pressure, it's pretty easy to say they're having a heart attack. What we try to do is being that MRI to say, let us look at what leads to that heart attack. So, looking at basically one of those financial types of risks that would lead to a future default, number one. And number two is, well, we have developed a very, very highly predictive and accurate default model for, public debt. That's easy because, all of the financial information is in the public domain. The models we have developed will work equally well, whether we're trying to take a look at commodity prices, or for that matter, we could even use those models and apply them to things like climate change and climate risk. And the only key is basically accessing the data and figuring out how to go ahead and apply it. So for us, we're focused, for example, on default risk. So if we tie that back to climate, there's a number of ways you could look at it. We could look at it to say, we could apply a carbon tax approach to it to say there's a cost to carbon creation, and basically apply that to, future manufacturing or future sales to say, should that cost be a real cost instead of an implied cost? Will that potentially increase the risk of default for somebody who's a large carbon generator. Secondarily, again, we deal with banks. So one of the things that we've worked with is some of our clients in Australia. In default, you've got the concept of probability of default, but if there is a default, banks take collateral. So what's the loss given default? So, we could take a look at geomapping and say, have the banks in Australia made loans where the collateral homes are basically in floodplains that weren't in floodplains when they made the loans, or in greater risk of bushfires, for example, where if those types of climate-related catastrophes happen, it would A, cause a loss, and B, cause a default, I should say, and in the case of default, because if it's underinsured, or cause a loss. So those are just some examples. We haven't done that in a commercial way, but where we see that there is an applicability to it, to the extent that you have the data and there's the commercial opportunity to implement those types of models.
I want to maybe take a pause on this and kind of ask you some, just because you've been with the company for such a long time. One of the things that we often talk to our academic entrepreneurs, PhDs on, is, what's the end goal? From your understanding, from Don and Bob, what was their exit strategy? What do they want to do with Kamakura?
So, I think there's three things. Great question. I think when Don and Bob asked me to come on board, one of the things we were challenged with is limited capital. So, we needed to do some sort of exit, and they did not want to work for a Silicon Valley hedge fund who's just going to simply say, whatever revenue you generate, I want more, and I want it last quarter instead of this quarter. So they wanted me to put us in a position to get capital. We got a lot of offers, and quite honestly, trying to raise capital as a Hawaii-based company is not easy. There's a lot of startup money here, but there's no growth capital here. And, we got a lot of nice offers at good valuations for people who wanted us to move to California. And we were in a position that we could say no. So when we did sell to SAS, one of the important things is they were committed with keeping us in Hawaii, and they basically committed that we want to grow what you've built there, and we want to create an ecosystem around risk research and quantitative methods around what you've already built. And that's one of the reasons that we accepted the buyout offer from SAS, in large part because of their commitment to allow us to continue to grow and build here in Hawaii. The other thing I'd say, besides the financial part of it, is that you had to, if I got into the detail of the software itself, I think everybody on this call would understand it. Most of our customers didn't. We were, to some degree, we were too advanced for what they were doing. And, I had to fight the tendency of some people here to simply say, if they didn't get it, you were stupid. Let me give you a quick story. When I was in business school, one of the cases we did was about a ski company called Head Ski. And Dr. Head started Head Ski, and his skis were technically more advanced than any other ski out there. It could go faster, it could cut angles more steeply, but unfortunately, the only people who could really take advantage of it was the ski patrol. The other thing that was unfortunate is that the Head Ski only came in black. And this is a point in time that what people were looking for behaviorally was colored skis, and you had K2 and others, and people wanted their ski to match their ski jacket, and that was more important than how it worked. He ended up having to sell out simply because his approach was, I don't have to produce my ski in all these different colors. I don't, the market will realize I have the most technically advanced skis. Well, the market didn't realize it. And, the basically to commercially scale your product, it's not always who has the most advanced product. And that's part of the role I played as a partner for Don and Bob, is they had the most advanced product, but it I want to say it dumbed down, but it had to be basically marketed in a way that a large enough market can easily understand it, even though that most of them may never have to use all those capabilities. It's for them to understand it was worth paying a premium to have those advanced capabilities, if you ever do want to use it.
That's fascinating. We've talked about this before, but the movement of Kamakura, especially around that whole Act 221 tax credit thing, was, my honest opinion, probably a really great success story for Kamakura. I think there's a lot of folks within the whole ecosystem are like, well, what did that do for us? But it sounds like, what was the starting employee count when you first moved over here?
Yeah, so I think that it worked out well. When we moved over here, we had 8 people, and I've looked up the numbers. The average salary was about $60,000 a year in salary, and when we sold, we have 23 employees here in Hawaii who had an average salary a little bit north of $180,000. So if you think about the multiplier effect of having going from 8 to 23 people in Hawaii, each of them paying income tax, sales tax, buying homes, and the multiplier effect, I think it would be a pretty good success story, that at least in our case, Act 221 benefited the state of Hawaii. And the other thing I'll mention is it wasn't always easy finding people, and we ended up having to recruit a number of people from the mainland, but our retention rate was incredibly high. So in the 11 years that I've been here, we only lost one developer, and that was to retirement. And if we were in Silicon Valley, people run across the street. So, I think the people that end up working here, select to live in Hawaii for reasons other than just, just the salary. I mean, they want a good salary, they want to be challenged, but I think it's a great secret that you can build a software company here, and you could recruit good people and you could retain them to a much easier degree than you can in the mainland, in my opinion.
Well, you just got to find a Martin Zorn that buys a property in Maui and decides to be a coffee farmer, right? So kind of continuing on the whole thread around exit, because I feel like a lot of us, especially for the Don and Bobs, they're trying to figure out, okay, 1990, it's been what, 3 decades, and now you guys got acquired by SAS, which I will post in there, is a phenomenal company. Can you tell us more about that? You had a great introduction of what SAS is and why.
Sure. So SAS, and I probably know a little more about them than most, because when I was with Wachovia in Raleigh, they were actually one of my clients. So SAS was started by Dr. Goodnight. Jim Goodnight was professor at NC State, and back in those days, basically there was 3 statistical software packages. SAS being one that North Carolina State kind of developed and licensed to other universities. There was one up in University of Michigan, I think it was SPCC, and then one that's still around today called Stato, which I think came out of Texas A&M or Texas Tech. And the market in those days was basically just licensing to other universities. And Dr. Goodnight and his partner Jim Saul basically said, we think that statistical tools are going to be more mainstream within corporations. And and NC State basically gave him the license to commercialize it outside of the university sector, and that's what ultimately became SAS. So these tools are used for everything that relates to money laundering and fraud and all the things that are necessary to take a look at risk analytics, whether you're an insurance company or a bank or a government entity. And what we did was complementary to what they did. So we were heavily placed within the U.S. insurance market and the global banking market for asset liability management, as well as what we do with Chris, which actually today is more used by fund managers. So our key fund managers that are clients include Fidelity Investments, Goldman Sachs Asset Management, Citadel, a lot of big names I could mention that use it, basically what they call looking for alpha, which is how do we find some trading information that could give us a higher yield. And one of the things that our systems do is that we identify, getting back that early notice of default risk. Generally the market trades off of credit ratings. So whether you're AA or BBB, one is 60% of the market is BBB. So there's not a lot of differentiation in ratings. So they're able to use that. And in some cases, we don't even know how they use it, but they use it in their quantitative algorithms that give them an advantage. And we know it works because they renew their contracts every year.
Well, it's fascinating to me that you folks were able to pull in some really large names, including some major $200+ billion pension funds too, including MetLife as well. And it's kind of fun fact, especially when you think about Maui and the whole Mahi Pono and the Canadian pension fund acquiring them for $600 million. It's just like, wow, there's definitely something there, which I'd like to think maybe you folks had some sort of influence of saying, hey, yeah, why don't you buy this 40,000 acres? But you said something to me about SAS, which is really fascinating, which is the culture. Could you talk about that?
Sure. I think that the basic culture, and that was important to us as well, because being started by people that were academics, the culture was really important. There's a lot of similarities in the history of the founders, and then basically the motto for SAS is, how will your curiosity change the world today? So it's around curiosity, it being inquisitive, and basically thinking big. And it's too easy to kind of take a look at what are all the limits and not really reach for more. One quick story: when I moved to Atlanta, I moved to Atlanta from Dallas, Texas, and Atlanta at the time was 500,000 people. I thought Atlanta was a nice mid-sized city, kind of like Dallas, Denver, Phoenix, a lot of other places. And Atlanta basically said, we want to be the next great world city. So they were thinking that we want to be New York or Los Angeles or Paris. And I quite honestly would not have put them in that category, but it was that thinking big. For example, I think got them the Olympics. If they simply said, "Oh, we want to be the next Denver," they probably would not have gotten the Olympics. So I think there's a lot to be said for thinking big, and rather than taking a look at what your constraints are, the constraints don't. Constraints are things that you have to live with and figure out how to work within those constraints, but don't let it limit what your vision is.
Yeah, well, especially when you think about how SAS was the model for both Google. I mean, I think you told me it was a case study Stanford utilized as a basis for what technology companies today are building culture around. That was fascinating.
Yeah, they have a 900-acre campus in Cary, North Carolina, and basically what they built there, Google and Apple before they built their Facebook, before they built their campuses, came and visited them to kind of see what Dr. Goodnight and his team had built and how they built it.
Yeah, I remember reading, was it, I think Working Mothers rated it like one of the top 100 places to work as a mother. I'm like, that's amazing. I mean, talk about forward looking. So kudos to the academics. um, does Dawn and Bob, do they live in Hawaii? I mean, what do they have a connection here?
Yeah, so Don lives here.
Hmm.
Don moved from Japan here and has been here since since 22 years now. Bob still teaches full time at Cornell. So, he's our director of research. We have him on our payroll full time, but he still teaches full time at Cornell. And then the other one that's significant that we have also worked with, and we call him a research fellow, is Professor Jens Hilscher. When we started work, Jens was in Boston teaching at Brandeis, and then he, more recently got tenure and moved to UC Davis. So, we've maintained, close relationships, with them. We also, as a research fellow, have worked very closely with one of the really leading visionaries for statistical work at Harvard, who is one of the leaders in the use of statistics that have helped us a lot as a research fellow as well, that we bounce ideas off of. So we've maintained close academic ties to continue to make sure that we're doing things that are leading edge. And again, our concern is that you learn from history, but you need to do simulations. you know, Bob has always said that history is just one scenario out of a Monte Carlo simulation.
Well, having taken a data analysis course and doing Monte Carlo simulations, yes, I can definitely concur with that. Well, we're going to start moving towards, and again, I'd love for folks within kind of the group here, Jeff, Arif, et cetera, if you have any questions from Martin, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we'll just keep kind of talking about different stories, et cetera. There's a fascinating perspective, especially with this particular program, as I told you before, Martin, where I believe that Hawaii is moving into a really fascinating phase around innovation and entrepreneurship. And as you have supported the ecosystem for the last 10 plus years, UH in particular as a system, we have an amazing amount of new programs that are spinning up specifically for, postdocs, professors, et cetera. And I'm excited to see some of these new companies, including the 3 court companies we have in Court 1. I was telling you a little bit about Nimbus AI and Hawaii Innovation Lab and Renewable Edge, et cetera. But any words or thoughts or suggestions for these folks?
Yeah, I think that that reaching out and if you're in the UH ecosystem is looking for how you could partner with different companies is helpful. In our case, one other thing I hadn't mentioned is one of our board members since day one was Vance Rowley. And part of that is that Don and Vance were classmates together at Harvard. So their relationship goes back a long time. But having Vance as one of our board members has been was and is very helpful. The other thing is we had a close relationship, with a lot of the people that taught over at Scheidler. So that helped us in everything from being steered towards some of the top students, which we brought in as interns. And then, additionally, we were able to, leverage some of those relationships. Dr. Jeng Yai, for example, who, Dr. I teaches insurance at Scheidler. We did a research paid research paper for the Society of Actuaries on default risk, and Jing helped us with that, and that relationship and kind of being able to have the UH faculty kind of weigh in on some of the people we interviewed, as well as being able to hire some of the students as interns, as well as being able to include them in some of the research efforts that we did, I think made both of us better at what we did.
Yeah. Well, I think you told me when we had lunch months ago about how Hawaii in particular, based on your experience with the Kamakura, et cetera, and maybe the larger, kind of risk industry. So whether it's financial risk or climate risk or whatever, I often think about how companies like Nimbus, who can play a large role in supporting this kind of export of knowledge, information. And I'd love for Jeff, or well, Peter just left, but Jeff, any thoughts about this, especially since, and to factor also, Jeff resides in East Coast now, but his heart is in Hawaii. I know that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I spent most of this call reflecting on the difficulties in pricing kind of derivatives on credit and debt as opposed to equities, where you have this like defined stream of future cash flows that you can discount. But yeah, I will say, in terms of, I think, using the relationship with UH, especially when it comes to evaluating talent, like students and things like that, that was very helpful for us, because one of Peter's students, who I think is just graduating with a master's degree now, we've kind of brought him in as a contractor and kind of showing him the industry and things like that. And that's been really, really good. We're kind of in a niche space where we can't just hire someone and expect them to do a good job immediately. There really is a learning curve to the industry. And the fact that we didn't need to conduct any interviews because Peter was familiar with his abilities. So when you said that, that's been true for us as well. I think that's been a big benefit.
Vincent, one other thing that, it's hard for me to kind of say how helpful was this from a commercial standpoint. I think that intellectually we learned from it. Being in Hawaii and even selling locally is, I said we had no clients in Hawaii, no paying clients in Hawaii, but we did some pro bono work. I'll give you an example. We did some with Kamehameha schools. Given their reliance on real estate, we said, look, let us go and take a look at basically how much you're spending out of the trust and whether it could live into perpetuity. And we will use our algorithms to apply it to what you're doing and see if it gives you, a different view than what you're getting from the advisors that you've used. We've done the same thing with, the Hawaii retirement system. And we said, look, the actuaries, the actuaries have a certain way of looking at what your unfunded retirement obligations are. We don't look at it from an accounting or an actuarial standpoint. We're looking at it from an economic standpoint. So we did both of those projects pro bono. It's not something that we, got a lot of leverage in talking about, but there's a lot of really smart people here, and it allowed them in some ways to probably be more transparent and share more data with us because of the way we did it than they would have had it been a commercial relationship. And I think that ultimately it made us better as a result of that.
How early on did you have these proof of concepts or pro bono work?
Well, with Kamehameha schools, it was during the credit crisis when real estate prices were falling. With the ERS, we did that. Probably, I'm going to say maybe, kind of 2012, 2013, during a period of time that the press was really publicizing what the unfunded pension obligations were for the state of Hawaii.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I just to interject, I think that talking about those two case studies is very helpful in any situation because they're very easy to understand. Whereas CDOs are not easy
Yeah.
instruments to understand. but assessing non-traditional risk versus actuarial tables for pension liabilities, or some application to real estate portfolio management, people can understand that. So I think that's very good. So I like to put that.
And Martin, just a little FYI, Jeff here has a PhD in mathematics, so.
I don't use it anymore, but it's back there.
Oh man. Well, some other folks in the call, Mark, just a heads up. So Leia is with our office as well. And Katie's been doing, actually, she was still is, has some role over in Maui with STEMworks Maui, and as over in Oahu. And just a little intro, Ken is with our office as well. He's a licensing associate. And Arif is one of the other entrepreneurs who I think you're on the East Coast now, Arif, but I know that he's been really busy and doing things. So
Yeah, there's a lot of talent in Hawaii. There's actually, going back to my HTDC days, and some of the grant applications I looked at for some of the grants for which HTDC is kind of the umbrella organization. You really realize how much development of intellectual property is being done here. A lot of it is just below radar because it's not always at the point of looking for the grant, it's not really commercially focused. But I think that the step from what's being developed to basically making it commercially applicable is a really small step compared to how much investment's done in creating the intellectual property to start with.
and maybe to kind of follow on a question on that statement based on what you had said earlier of not wanting to take venture capital money, et cetera. How was Kamakura, like, what was some of the first customers, early customers? How did you folks go about actually securing those contracts? Because it sounds like you grew organically.
Yeah, we did grow organically. It was tough. I mean, being a small company, I mean, one of the downsides is, the early companies were those that really wanted something that the other commercial vendors would not provide. And we probably gave up a little more in terms of maybe pricing, maybe some of the contractual control that the larger vendors would never agree to, but to get the names. The other thing that we focused on a lot, especially because we were focused on banking, was a strategy of selling to the central banks and the regulators. So I haven't talked about it, but Bank of England, European Central Bank, Federal Reserve Bank, Comptroller of the Currency are all clients of ours. And the central banks and the regulators, do tend to have a little more of an academic orientation than you might find in just straight, commercial customer. But the other thing that did, as a small company out of Hawaii, it made a big difference to be able to go to a bank and they say, what other banks are using you? And all of a sudden you tell them their two primary regulators, the Federal Reserve and the Comptroller, are our clients. Some of their hesitancy to deal with somebody like Kamakura, who they'd say, if you're in Chicago, has a funny name, and is in Hawaii, and is not a household name like IBM, all of a sudden adds credibility.
Yeah, I gotta say, until I met you, I had no idea there was such an organization doing business headquartered out of Hawaii. It's kind of a breath of fresh air, and I think more folks need to know about this story. So I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing and supporting the ecosystem, et cetera. So,
well, I think you can grow a business here. We're delighted that SAS has made the commitment to build upon what we already, the foundation we built in Hawaii, and plan to add more people here and grow the infrastructure that's here. And I think that too often, if you're in Hawaii, the venture capital term that's put on companies is you're a lifestyle company. That you're in Hawaii because you have a founder who wants to go surfing or something of that nature. And I think that's the biggest obstacle all of us have, is to prove that you can build a successful business here in Hawaii.
Boy, I wish you could make it public, the disclosed amount to which you were acquired, because I think it would really turn heads and be like, whoa, maybe these lifestyle businesses actually can be pretty profitable. But we'll stick with a boatload of cash.
Yeah, sounds good. That will keep my my parent organization from suing me or firing me.
We don't want that. We don't want that. Okay. Well, we're gonna wrap up things, but if anyone has any further questions, I see Len joined. Thanks, Len, for joining us.
I have a question. Sorry, Len, did I interrupt you? Were you going to say something?
I was just gonna say I tuned in because Martin is like one of my favorite people, and I haven't heard the entire story. I've heard bits and pieces of it over the course of many years. So I'm sorry I got caught up in something else, but glad I got to at least tune in to the end. So go ahead, Katie.
Thanks, Len. Martin, I have a question. You said a lot of startup capital in Hawaii, but no growth capital. How do you think, what are some solutions to that? How do you think we can start to bring that growth capital here?
I have a couple different ideas. I think the problem, the states try to address it in a couple different ways. I think that one of the things is that the banks here are well run and they're conservative, which simply means they want hard collateral. So that for us as a software company, our receivables were our best collateral, but it's not something that the local banks could lend on. John Dean started some of this with his background when he was running Central Pacific. Obviously, with the turnaround he had there were things that he couldn't do. The state's trying to address it in a variety of ways, investing in venture funds, saying the venture funds should invest in here. I think what it ultimately will take is a couple successful companies that as a result will be willing to reinvest locally. I wish that Amador is doing a lot of good things, but not necessarily in the software space, but that's a good example. I mean, Amador is doing direct investments that would allow growth in some sustainable agricultural areas. And I think it's it's going to take time. It's going to take some recruiting to try to get some patient money here and convince them that you can do business. One idea, there's a lot of government programs that range from USDA to SBIC, but typically those are just hard to get the money. And I think ultimately it's continuing to try to develop some stories about success stories to get people to either invest here from the mainland or have enough success stories locally that they're investing in that ecosystem, to try to propel the startup companies to the next level, as opposed to the startup companies feeling like they could get to a certain level in Hawaii and then they have to move to the mainland. Unfortunately, there's no easy answer, no silver bullet to kind of say, hey, just do this one thing or another to kind of change that.
Well, one thing when we had lunch, you talked about while your role within HTC, but also looking at future industries. And again, I said this before about risk. Talk to me about some of the thoughts you had, especially around growing a risk management, risk insurance, all that in Hawaii, and why that made sense in your mind.
Yeah, so certain areas have basically looked from a regulatory standpoint of how they could use regulations as a way to stimulate some industries. So Hawaii, for example, was one of the early states, along with Nevada and Arizona, for example, to have some very favorable regulations around reinsurance. We never really marketed it. So if you take a look at the majority of reinsurance companies that have been created in the US, that if they're in the US or in Arizona because of that law. I think the second thing is there's a concept of an industrial bank. South Dakota, Nevada, Utah, basically did that. So you look at most of the, car manufacturers, BMW Bank, you look at the credit cards, they're in South Dakota and Utah, not for any economic, geographic reason, but because of that regulation. So, I think that there are some opportunities, there to be creative and say, what can the state potentially do to stimulate new industries there? So that's one thing. When I was on the HTDC board, as Len knows, there were some things that were done with the Department of Consumer Affairs around cyber currency, which I was really, really excited about, because that's an example of how the state can use its regulatory powers to try to differentiate itself geographically, to make it an attractive place to do business with no cost to the state taxpayer in doing it. I think the other thing is taking a look at those things that we just have a natural advantage and leverage it more, whether it's oceanography or some of the other types of activities, just because of our physical location, that we could really leverage to a greater degree. I mean, at the end of the day, I talked about Act 221, but the other thing that factored into it at the time we moved here, 100% of our clients were in Japan. We've used the time zone at Kamakura to our advantage, because at the time we moved, we were the closest time zone to being in the US to our Japanese clients. And basically, we have the ability, and we have kind of, with developers globally, being able to leverage a 24/7 time zone, being that early morning here is business hours on the East Coast or in Europe. Afternoon here is morning and business hours in Australia and Asia. And we've done a lot of proofs of concept where, we basically had teams in all three locations managed out of Hawaii, being able to put together, proofs of concept for people. And we were able to do it efficiently because we were able to leverage the time zone we're in.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I think a lot of other folks have been trying to do that too. So it's good to hear that you concur with that. Katie, you want to just ask that question? We'll wrap things up.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, so we have newer companies coming in. So it is founded by Steve Wozniak and Alex Fielding. It's called Privateer Space. It's essentially a software development company, but they decided to build and grow on Maui. And so is that their kind of success story? Do you think that's the kind of success story that you can leverage for other software aerospace startups in Hawaii?
Absolutely. I think just like Kamakura, I think that that there's just not a lot of publicity about what those different success stories are. And I think the more that that we could tell that story, success is contagious. And I think a lot of it is simply getting the story out there.
Okay, folks. Well, we are unfortunately out of time, but Martin, so appreciate you, and thank you again for supporting the industry here in Hawaii, and being a growing coffee farmer, so we can all continue to enjoy our cup of Joe. But I will folks feel free to reach out to Martin on LinkedIn. And again, thank you for all that you do, and thank you for being a 6-star story in Hawaii. And hopefully one day we'll be able to make Kamakura a household name.
Sounds great. And love to see continued success of technology companies here, and you'll find a couple more breakthroughs, and happy to help anyone at any time to do that.
Well, we're betting big on Nimbus, HIL, and Unibadge, so more later then.
Sounds good. Mahalo.
Thanks everyone for joining. Take care.
Thanks.